some depths stay open for years. Chapter 5. Kaʻena Point, Kamehameha and the comeback whale finds our narrator returning to a stretch of Oʻahu's northwest coast he and his wife never quite finished, carrying with them a whale sighting that never happened on an earlier trip, and the long shadow of Kamehameha I, a king who understood better than most that outside arrivals, whether foreign ships, foreign weapons or foreign advisors, could be absorbed and turned to advantage rather than simply endured. That same coastline, once a corridor for whalers whose industry reshaped Hawaii before collapsing entirely, is now a transit route for humpbacks heading south, and this time the whale actually shows up. Gold light hammered the volcanic coast, radiating off the asphalt in visible waves that turned the horizon into a shimmering, indistinct blur of heat and salt spray. The air smelled of dried brine, cooked dust, and the faint, sulphurous memory of the island's explosive geological birth, feeling less like a tropical vacation and more like the opening scene of a survivalist thriller. We had ventured out from the manicured safety of Ko'olina to settle a debt with the landscape itself, a specific 6-mile jagged gap in my completionist soul, left open by an aborted attempt at this very trek 5 years prior. Before communing with the raw majesty of nature, however, protocol dictated a stop at a vital cultural institution. Long's Drugs is technically a CVS now, having been absorbed by mainland corporate infrastructure, a transition that substitutes local quirks for standardized efficiency. Inside, I faced a trial of character in the snack aisle. The bag of Tabasco-infused bugles called to me like a siren song of processed corn and spicy vinegar. I successfully resisted the urge to purchase them. It was a victory for my digestive system that I framed as a Herculean triumph of will, though I still feel a lingering melodramatic regret over the lost opportunity for spicy cone-shaped sodium. The destination, Kaʻena Point State Park, sits uncomfortably close to a Space Force installation, because apparently nothing complements a pristine seabird sanctuary, quite like the looming logistics of orbital defense. To ensure our penance for previous laziness was absolute, the universe conspired to have the road under repair, rendering parking entirely non-existent. We had actually driven out here a few days prior, looked at the distance, and fled in cowardice. Today, the lack of proximity forced us to park even farther back, transforming the walk into an odyssey before we even reached the trailhead. The hike moved through a stark, sun-bleached beauty, flanked by a restless ocean populated by surfers waiting for the perfect swell. These figures bobbing in the water appeared as a collection of diverse, elevated archetypes: ancient Polynesian navigators reading the currents, Zen masters meditating on the fluidity of existence, hydrodynamic engineers analyzing wave propagation, or simply unmotivated stoners avoiding gainful employment. The latter interpretation feels uncharitable and yet, frankly, the most statistically probable. Then the ocean decided to interrupt my cynical sociology with a display of biological grandeur. A humpback whale breached in the middle distance, shooting straight up into the sky like a 60-ton blubber-encased rocket. I shrieked with an excitement that I am told was unsettlingly loud, a vocalization of pure terror joy that likely confused the local seabirds. While I was busy frightening my wife with my volume, she managed to snap a series of excellent photos, proving once again that in a crisis she is the documentarian and I am merely the noise pollution. A massive white plume marked the giant's exit as it crashed back down into the depths. Watching the ripples expand outward, it became clear that Oʻahu's deep, dark northwest coast is more than just a scenic view from a dusty trail. It is an active oceanic highway serving a much older, cyclical journey. Whale song between Alaska and Hawaii. Just as the ripples from that initial breach expanded and the reverberations of my unseemly shriek subsided, the creature slapped the water again with a disturbingly majestic force. While I was busy recomposing my dignity on the cliffside of Kaʻena Point, the biology of the moment demanded attention. The humpback whale, Megaptera novaeangliae, down below was completing a transoceanic commute from Alaska that made my anniversary flight from Dallas look like a trip to the mailbox. These leviathans arrive in the islands between November and May, not for the beaches, but for a biological imperative that involves mating, birthing, and nursing calves in what amounts to a warm water nursery. They do not eat while in Hawaii. Every calorie burned for that spectacular breach, an act used to dislodge parasites or communicate dominance, was strictly budgeted from blubber stores accumulated during the northern summer. It creates a caloric deficit that I can only describe as a dangerously enthusiastic diet plan. The geography of this archipelago dictates the mechanics of that highway. Oʻahu's northwest shoreline serves as a transit corridor, a steep aquatic route whales use to move between the open ocean and the sheltered breeding grounds of the neighbor islands to the southeast. It is the lack of urban density here, offering a stark contrast of white spray against the deep blue far removed from the crowded skyline of Waikiraka, that makes the surface activity so visible. However, the true center of this aquatic society is the Maui Nui Basin, specifically the Oʻahu Channel between West Maui and Lanai. Mother whales, behaving with the protective instincts of nervous guardians, prefer waters shallower than 600 feet to rest and nurse their calves, effectively using the bathymetry to shield their offspring from deep water predators and rough swells. The history of this relationship is not nearly as serene as the view. Long before the 19th-century industrial slaughter, the whale was culturally significant to the indigenous population, evidenced by linguistic artifacts like pareamoa, or whalebone clubs, found across the Pacific. By the 1840s, however, the script had flipped to extraction. The town of Lahaina, once a royal capital, transformed into a provisioning hub for the Pacific whaling fleet. The industry became so central to the local economy that the Lahaina lighthouse was originally fueled by oil harvested from the surrounding waters. Conservation efforts eventually reversed that trajectory. Following the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and the establishment of the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary in 1992, the population realized a massive rebound. By the 2010s, roughly 12,000 of the estimated 20,000 North Pacific humpbacks were visiting Hawaii each winter. Current regulations strictly prohibit approaching the animals within 100 yards by boat or drone. The distance maintains their breeding habitat while allowing completionists like myself to observe from a respectful, if slightly loud, distance on shore. Maui whales, from oil to ore. Watching that wild white water kick up off the coast of Kaʻena Point triggered a very specific, slightly traumatic flashback. 15 years prior, on our first trip to Hawaii as a newly married couple, we boarded a short inter-island flight from Oʻahu to Maui. As we waited on the tarmac, I decided to assert my intellectual dominance by challenging my wife to a game of travel chess. I played with the ruthless efficiency of a grandmaster facing a toddler, soundly crushing her defenses. I expected admiration. I received a glare that could have peeled paint off the fuselage. This was a side of her I had not encountered in our 6-month courtship, a genuine boiling rage at losing. The pilot interrupted this domestic Cold War to announce that humpbacks might be visible below. I spent the entire flight with my face pressed against the plexiglass, cringing in anticipation of a breach that never came. The ocean was empty. It felt like the whales were hiding from us, or perhaps just from me and my winning chess strategy. Now, a decade and a half later, the water is thick with them. That radical shift between our flights mirrors the island's volatile history with the massive mammals. The recovery I had just shrieked at from the cliffside was hard-won. Before modern conservation reversed the trend, the flight path we took 15 years ago crossed waters that functioned as the Saudi Arabia of the 19th century. The joke, of course, is that wherever there is oil, the United States will inevitably appear, even if you represent that oil in the form of a 40-ton swimming mammal. The first whaling ships anchored in 1819 and 1820, kicking off a blubber rush. While Lahaina operated as the rowdy break room of the Pacific where crews blew their paychecks and fought local police, Honolulu became the corporate office. Its deep harbor allowed for heavy lifting and repairs, eventually causing the government to move the capital there permanently to stay close to the tax revenue. This influx of commerce collided with the arrival of American Protestant missionaries in 1820, setting up a social dynamic that amounted to a cage match between God and grog. The chiefs and missionaries pioneered the women laws, placing a kapu on women swimming out to ships for illicit purposes. The whalers, who were not generally known for their celibacy or respect for local jurisprudence, reacted poorly. Tensions snapped in the mid-1820s during the Lahaina riots. In one incident involving the ship John Palmer, the thwump crack of cannon fire echoed across the water as sailors shot at the mission house, prompting Governor Hopili to build a fort simply to keep tourists from shelling the clergy. Herman Melville served as the most famous chronicler of this chaos. He arrived on a whaler and was discharged in Lahaina in May 1843. His time drifting through the islands informed his early novels Taipei and Oʻahu, giving readers a street-level view of the friction between the missionaries, the Hawaiian government, and libertine sailors. The industry pulled Hawaii into the global economy with the subtlety of a harpoon. Many native Hawaiian men, or Kanaka, joined the crews and gained legendary reputations as watermen from the Arctic to the Atlantic. The boom also brought the first major wave of Portuguese immigrants from the Azores who hitched rides on whale ships before deciding that farming on solid ground was preferable to chasing leviathans. The era collapsed in the late 1850s. It ended not because of a sudden burst of environmental conscience, but because someone in Pennsylvania discovered that digging holes in the ground for petroleum was easier than sailing around the world to kill animals for lamp fuel. That shift in the energy market ultimately saved the humpbacks. Now, walking farther down the coastal trail at Kaʻena Point in the warming breeze, with the ocean populated once more, our attention naturally shifted from the recovering waters back to the vulnerable shoreline we were navigating. Hawaii's stink bloom behind the predator fence. Satisfying a long-held grudge against the empty ocean felt magnificent. We had finally seen our whale. But as we turned away from the recovering waters and looked back toward the trail, the contrast sharpened. The sea was healing. The land, however, remained locked in a slow-motion biological riot. We drifted off the path to inspect a local plant, specifically a suspicious succulent from South Africa that lacked the decency to smell like a flower. It opted instead for the rotting meat cologne characteristic of the carrion flower. It was an invasive species, much like the mongooses the nearby predator fence was designed to repel. This fence, an imposing piece of exclusionary architecture, protected the nesting seabirds in the dunes. It effectively provided them with a gated community, free from feral cats, rodents, and other four-legged nuisances that might lower the property value of a burrow. Hawaii's extreme isolation has historically made the archipelago a soft target for biological gatecrashers. This deep fragility allowed non-native species to transform the landscape from the damp cloud forests down to the coastal reefs. Mentally cataloguing the invaders makes the islands feel less like an untouched paradise and more like an ecological siege. The insect world presents an urgent threat through the coconut rhinoceros beetle. First detected on Oʻahu in 2013, this armored nuisance bores into palm crowns to drink sap. It is a lethal habit for both agricultural coconuts and native lulu palms. The conflict is fueled by compost, as the beetle thrives in green waste, turning mulch piles into nurseries for its larvae. Oʻahu is currently classified as island-wide infested, a phrase that sounds like a distinct panic level on a government dashboard. Recent incursions have been fought on Kauai using dogs trained to sniff out breeding sites, a canine paw patrol infinitely more useful than the cartoon version. The reptile situation unfolds with equal chaos. Hawaii's lizards are almost entirely introduced colonists who have drafted a complex treaty to coexist. The Jackson's chameleon, a refugee from the 1972 pet trade, has frequently been dissected and found to be full of native snails. Conversely, the green and brown anoles established a vertical truce. The brown anoles, aggressive arrivals likely from Florida, dominate the ground. This territorial grab forces the green anoles into the treetops. It is a segregation of real estate mirroring the rigid class structures of Victorian England, just with more parasitic worms. Meanwhile, the gold dust day gecko, a neon green mascot for insurance companies, descends from a single jailbreak of 8 lizards near the University of Hawaii in 1974. Flora here behaves just as aggressively. The African tulip tree, accurately described as the flashiest invader, spreads via wind-borne seeds to create dense monocultures that bully native forests into submission. Then come the mammals. In 1793, Captain George Vancouver gifted goats to Maui's King Kahekili II. That present ranks alongside the Trojan horse in unforeseen consequences. Unchecked grazing on islands like Kaho'olawe triggered soil erosion so massive that restoration crews are still trying to glue the landscape back together centuries later, leaving once pristine white sand beaches stained by rust-red dirt. Even the birds outside our room operated as planted agents. The saffron finch, a South American import, thrives in manicured landscapes like Ko'olina. It fills an ecological niche optimized by humans who prefer their nature organized and predictable. State authorities beg visitors to report priority pests to the 643 pest hotline. It is a number I imagined dialing every time I saw a suspiciously aggressive shrub. Later, walking back to the hotel property, the coastal temperature climbed comfortably into the 80s. The mild climate easily lulls a person into ignoring the biological warfare happening in the bushes. We passed the usual scattering of sunburnt tourists heading out to snorkel, but my attention was hijacked by a sticker slapped onto a trail sign. It depicted Greta Thunberg, the teenage climate icon, holding a firearm. The image was hilarious. The juxtaposition of apocalyptic climate activism and Second Amendment firepower represents a highly specific brand of American irony. Saving the planet, presumably one bullet at a time. Yet that strange overlap of environmental friction and imported guns clicked into a broader local context. Long before ecology became a point of conflict, the actual introduction of foreign firearms fundamentally rewrote the island's balance of power. Kamehameha, cannons, and the law of mercy. That historical shift began in earnest when new weaponry met a leader capable of wielding it. The invasive plants and insects we had just walked past were problematic, certainly, but they lacked the organized ambition of those who came later. While the natural world fought a slow biological war in the sand dunes, political authority in the islands demonstrated how foreign arrivals provided the leverage for a completely different kind of ecosystem engineer. Kamehameha I, later styled as Kamehameha the Great, was a man who understood the value of momentum. In the late 18th century, the islands remained a fractured collection of chiefdoms. He viewed this political reality less as an exercise in cultural diversity and more as an efficiency problem. Solving it would require divine intervention, heavy artillery, and a managerial style best described as aggressive acquisition. Unlike rival chiefs who treated European vessels as floating department stores for trinkets, Kamehameha recognized them as defense contractors. Following the Oʻahu massacre, a violent skirmish that soured relations but yielded high-value salvage, his forces captured the schooner Fair American in 1790. This prize provided him with a largely intact arsenal, including muskets and a cannon he affectionately named Lopaka. To operate this hardware, he employed John Young and Isaac Davis, the two British sailors recently detained on the islands. Appointing kidnapped seamen as the primary architects of a national defense strategy sounds absurd. Given the average 18th-century mariner's affinity for rum and mutiny, it is a lunacy so profound it circles back to genius. Under their drill instruction, the Hawaiian army converted from a traditional warrior caste into a disciplined force capable of volley fire. This tactical upgrade proved decisive at the Battle of Kapaniwai on Maui and the naval engagement of Kepuaha Ulaula. By 1795, Kamehameha brought this modernized fury to Oʻahu. Despite the defection of his own ally, spoiler alert if they ever make Season 2 of Chief of War, Kaʻena to the opposing side, Kamehameha's artillery drove the Oʻahu defenders up the valley and eventually over the sheer cliffs of the Nuuanu Pali. That grim functionality of gravity cemented his rule. History, however, is rarely satisfied with a one-dimensional protagonist. The same man who utilized cannons to hurl defenders off cliffs is also credited with one of the Pacific's most enduring human rights doctrines. The law of the splintered paddle, or Kanawai Mamalaho, arose from a botched raid in Puna around 1797. During a skirmish, Kamehameha's foot became trapped in a reef. A local fisherman, seeing the king helpless and likely fearing for his family's safety, brought a paddle down on Kamehameha's head with enough force to shatter the wood. Years later, rather than executing the fisherman, the standard operating procedure for a warlord with a headache, Kamehameha pardoned him. He reasoned that the man was merely defending his kin, a right that should be universal. He decreed that non-combatants, specifically the elderly and children, must be allowed to sleep by the roadside without fear of harm. This law fundamentally shifted the concept of mana, or power, from the mere ability to destroy to the absolute obligation to protect, weaving a thread of humanitarian responsibility into the legal fabric of the kingdom. The execution of the laws is more important than the making of them. Thomas Jefferson. Kamehameha, Kapu, and Parking Lot Prophecy. Yet the ancient decree that one might lie down by the roadside in safety apparently does not extend to the paved environs of a gas station during the midday meal. Seeking sustenance that was not merely processed grease, I consulted a digital map, which directed us to a smoothie establishment where I, a creature of habit, confused the genre entirely by ordering a panini. As we ate, we witnessed a fascinating sociological performance in the adjacent lot involving 8 young women engaged in a kinetic dispute. To the untrained eye, it looked like a brawl, but I prefer to interpret it as a vigorous, impromptu council of war, a high-stakes negotiation of status conducted through the medium of hair-pulling. It was a chaotic scene, so mesmerizing in its raw, unchoreographed violence that a passing motorist, entranced by the ceremony, nearly embedded his front bumper into my rental car in a moment of rapturous rubbernecking. This display of parking lot dominance felt like a faint, chaotic echo of the island's more regimented past, where violence operated as a tool of statecraft rather than recreational aggression. To fulfill a prophecy that promised he would unite the islands if he constructed a great temple to his family war god, Kukailimoku, Kamehameha built the massive Pu'ukohola Heiau at Kauai on the island of Hawaii. The consecration of this luakini heiau, a temple requiring human sacrifice, demanded a high-status offering, and the guest list was exceedingly exclusive. Kamehameha invited his cousin and chief rival Keoa to the dedication in 1791. In a lethal breach of traditional hospitality, Keoa became the principal sacrifice. He arrived at Kauai fully aware that he was walking into a trap and functioning as the intended main course. In an act of final desperate resistance, Keoa reportedly performed a ritual of self-mutilation before landing, rendering himself an imperfect offering. He intended to spiritually taint the sacrifice, essentially spoiling the meat to starve the god and deny Kamehameha the full mana of the ritual. Despite this act of defiance, Keoa was killed and placed on the heiau regardless, because theological technicalities rarely stop a determined conqueror. Keoa's death removed the last significant opposition on the Big Island. With his rival gone and the prophecy fulfilled, Kamehameha became the undisputed ruler of Hawaii Island, positioning him to launch the invasions of Maui and Oʻahu that eventually unified the chain. Throughout this bloody consolidation of power, Kamehameha remained a staunch defender of the traditional kapu system. He maintained and rebuilt significant religious sites, such as the Halulu Heiau at Kaunolu on Lanai, which he used as a royal retreat. He was metaphorically referred to as the High Chief who eats the islands, a title that suggested a terrifying literal appetite, but actually signified his political dominance over the districts rather than physical consumption. His success relied heavily on managing relationships with powerful alii, particularly the four Kona chiefs. This group included Kamaiamoku, often called his uncle, whose twin brother Kamanawa also acted as a key counselor, providing the genealogical legitimacy and military manpower necessary for his campaigns. Kamehameha further cemented his authority by marrying high-ranking chiefesses, including Keopulani, the high-ranking woman in the islands, and Ka'ahumanu, his favorite wife and a future political powerhouse. Kamehameha I essentially bridged two eras, ruling as the last great sovereign of the old feudal order and the first monarch of an internationally recognized kingdom. Upon his death in 1819, the traditional religious order he upheld immediately began to fracture, and his successor Liholiho, guided by the powerful widow Ka'ahumanu, abolished the kapu system shortly after his passing. With the old laws shattered and the temples falling silent, what new power would rush in to fill the spiritual vacuum left in the wake of the gods? Haioli in Hawaii, stranger or slur? The immediate answer arrived on foreign ships. When kingdoms open their doors, dictionaries hastily rewrite themselves. Kamehameha's newly unified and internationally recognized government brought a steady influx of outsiders to the islands, requiring a term to describe the unfamiliar faces stepping onto the docks. Enter the word haole. Historically, it is a Hawaiian descriptive noun meaning outsider, foreigner, or Caucasian. To the casual observer, the word projects a polite public facade, functioning simply as a neutral geographic categorization. Pull back the panel, however, and you find its true internal machinery. A highly sensitive socio-linguistic thermostat measuring exactly how annoyed a local resident is with your specific behavior at any given millisecond. The term itself is not inherently a slur, as its meaning shifts from a dry descriptor to an offensive insult, depending entirely on the speaker's tone, delivery, and the immediate context of the situation. During the era of early contact, Hawaiian language records used the term simply to classify foreigners who arrived and decided to stay. Foreign advisors who served King Kamehameha I, such as the British sailor John Young, were sometimes referred to in native texts as haole kokua, or foreign helpers. Young proved so useful that he was eventually elevated to the status of a recognized chief. establishing early on that being a foreigner was not a permanent disadvantage provided you brought along a working knowledge of naval artillery. As the plantation era gained momentum and brought new waves of immigration to the islands, social stratification shifted, and the word evolved into a more rigid demographic identity. The Portuguese contract laborers who arrived to work the fields eventually split along these invisible fault lines. While many folded into the broader multi-ethnic local culture that developed, others were gradually absorbed into the Haiole, or white, identity stream. Today, the word frequently surfaces in arguments regarding the perpetual friction between residents and new arrivals. These debates usually orbit the predictable topics of tourism, land ownership, and property development. On islands like Molokai, the community fiercely defends its subsistence lifestyle, cultural practices, and control over the land. When residents successfully mobilized to shut down the massive Lau Point resort development, visitors often read the resulting atmosphere as a blanket hostility toward Haioles. There is no shortage of online anecdotes from travelers claiming they experienced intense anti-Haole sentiment. Still, receiving a hostile glare or being called a slur in a parking lot does not legally constitute a hate crime. Federal and state definitions require an underlying criminal offense coupled with demonstrable bias, meaning you cannot call the authorities simply because someone ruined your afternoon mood. Violent incidents do occur, however, such as a rare federal hate crime prosecution on Maui involving an assault on a white homeowner by native Hawaiian defendants. The case proved that anti-white bias can indeed trigger federal penalties when tied to a physical act, ultimately feeding the restless Leviathan of liability. That underlying tension leaves behind an unpredictable atmospheric pressure, one that makes a visiting outsider acutely aware of exactly how they look, how they act, and where they choose to idle. How Hawaii mixed the Pacific Deck. To untangle the knot of who actually qualifies as an absolute outsider in these islands requires a genetic map of exhausting complexity. Long before anyone was arguing about neighborhood aesthetics, local jurisdiction, or the limits of modern tourism, the foundational makeup of native Hawaiians was already operating as an open oceanic crossroads. Modern genome studies assert that the Polynesian founders belong to the broader Austronesian group, an ethno-linguistic collection originating near Taiwan before sailing south. As these early mariners navigated island Melanesia, they intermarried with existing Australo-Melanesian populations. The resulting Polynesian genetic code settled at roughly 79% Austronesian and 21% Melanesian. The earliest voyagers were clearly highly adept at making friends while charting empty oceans. The ancient Pacific was hardly a locked vault. A 2020 DNA study revealed a distinct Native American genetic signal across eastern Polynesia. This specific signature traces directly to indigenous populations living on the Pacific coast of present-day Colombia around 1200 AD. The timeline conveniently mirrors the eastward spread of the sweet potato, an undeniably South American crop that became a Polynesian dietary staple centuries before clumsy European galleons learned how to get lost in the exact same waters. Polynesians apparently encountered Native Americans in the Central Eastern Pacific, swapped some genes and tubers, and calmly continued their outward expansion. When late 18th-century European explorers arrived hoping to assert continental superiority, Hawaiian ruling chiefs promptly digested the newcomers into their own political machinery. Early arrivals who possessed actual maritime or military skills were not treated as mere consultants to be ignored at will. They were aggressively domesticated through kinship and grants of land. The British sailor John Young and the Welsh mariner Isaac Davis had become indispensable military advisors to Kamehameha I in the 1790s precisely through this dynamic. Both men were granted high chief status and married into prominent royal lines. Young married Kamehameha's niece, permanently tying his lineage to the Hawaiian monarchy and producing a descendant, Queen Emma, who later became a revered sovereign. The 19th and 20th centuries introduced the plantation era, which imported a massive agricultural workforce to satisfy the economic appetites of the major sugar and pineapple corporations. Japanese contract laborers arrived in large numbers starting around 1885. By 1920, they formed 43% of the island population, heavily embedding their social customs and foods into the local environment. Portuguese immigrants began arriving in 1878 from the Azores and Madeira. Unlike other groups arriving as single men, the Portuguese were urged to bring their whole families. This practical strategy encouraged permanent settlement. Generations of Portuguese Hawaiians eventually intermarried so broadly that their precise ethnic boundaries dissolved while their cultural influence stayed put. Living crammed together in dense plantation camps forced a daily collision of distinct worlds, creating what is now recognized as local Hawaii culture. Workers from entirely different linguistic backgrounds had to communicate with English-speaking overseers. This daily necessity led to the creation of Hawaii Creole English. Widely known as Pidgin, this fully realized language functioned as the social mortar of the community and currently holds official federal recognition. Local dining tables reflect the exact same pragmatic mixing. Traditional royal staples, such as poi, now comfortably share plates with Chinese manapua, Japanese spam musubi, and massive bowls of saimin. Visual and musical identities underwent an identical process of enthusiastic borrowing. The famous Hawaiian ukulele is merely a slight tropical rebranding of the braguinha and cavaquinho, small Portuguese instruments introduced by Madeiran cabinet makers in 1879. Slack-key guitar emerged in the 1830s when locals took imported Spanish guitars left by Mexican cowboys and retuned the strings to match indigenous vocal styles. Later, 20th-century music spawned hapa haole tracks mimicking mainland radio rhythms, followed by Jawaiian music, a local reggae evolution that currently dictates island radio rotations. Fashion followed the same trajectory of opportunistic redesign. Early Hawaiian attire relied on bark cloth garments, including the loincloth and the wrap skirt. When 19th-century Calvinist missionaries insisted on conservative dresses, local women completely reworked the mandatory modesty to suit both the punishing equatorial heat and their own visual aesthetics. The resulting formal gown with a train and its looser casual cousin became universally accepted standard attire. Even the iconic Aloha shirt was engineered in the 1930s by Honolulu tailors who decided to stitch Japanese printed textiles into Western collared shirts featuring island motifs. "No man is an island, entire of itself," observed John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, 1624. John Young, stranger-turned-chief in Makaha. You might regard the act of waiting on a sidewalk, especially after witnessing a gas station battle royale, as a simple passive interval of pedestrian stasis. In reality, it is a complex geopolitical negotiation, a frantic internal machinery of threat assessment where posture, eye contact, and the precise angle of one's chin are the volatile currency of survival. While we occupied this sidewalk purgatory in the Makaha area, a stranger approached. This region possesses a reputation for being somewhat rough, a euphemism suggesting that the locals are fiercely protective of their turf and view outsiders with the same warm skepticism an immune system reserves for a virus. There is a significant homeless population here, yet the community embraces them with a defensive loyalty that defies standard suburban logic. I recalled a local Facebook thread where residents complained about a homeless man living in a bus shelter, effectively preventing schoolchildren from sitting down. The comments section, rather than calling for his removal, largely defended the man's squatter's rights with the ferocity of a homeowners association protecting a heritage tree, arguing he needed the roof more than the kids needed a bench. So when this particular gentleman walked up to us, not looking particularly disheveled but vibrating with an energy that I can only describe as unusual, I was forced to perform the intricate social calculus of the wary traveler. He was likely just a guy who enjoyed chatting with random strangers, but in the gamble of travel, you never really know if you are being greeted or cased. I had to balance the imperative of not being too friendly, which invites chaos, with the necessity of not being rude enough to invite a punch in the face. John Young pulled this off perfectly. That stranded British boatswain managed the ultimate career pivot, transitioning from a detained foreign helper to one of the most powerful chiefs and advisors in the Hawaiian kingdom. His ascent began with a logistical nightmare in March 1790. Young arrived on the American fur-trading brig Eleanora under the command of Simon Metcalfe. While the ship anchored at Kealakekua Bay, Young went ashore for what he presumably thought was standard shore leave. Instead, Kamehameha I detained him. The king placed him under house arrest to prevent him from returning to the ship. The king had a pragmatic reason for this kidnapping. Recall that he needed to suppress the news that Metcalfe's son, Thomas, had just been killed and his schooner, the Fair American, captured by the chief Kamiamoku in retaliation for a flogging. Simon Metcalfe, unaware of the carnage, waited 2 days for Young to return. He fired signal guns into the void. Eventually, he sailed for China without his boatswain. Abandonment is just travel without a return ticket. Metcalfe left behind both his boatswain and the body of his son. Stranded but resourceful, Young, along with Isaac Davis, the sole survivor of the Fair American massacre, was integrated into Kamehameha's inner circle. They became critical military assets in an aggressive consolidation of island power. Young earned the Hawaiian name Olohana, a moniker derived from his habit of shouting the nautical command "all hands" at anyone within earshot. Armed with the foreign artillery knowledge that first secured his life, Young and Davis operated the cannon captured from the Fair American. This weapon was fearsome enough to be named Lopaka, and their proficiency with this red-mouthed gun proved instrumental in the Battle of Kepaniwai on Maui and the naval engagement of Kepuaha'ulaula off Waipio in 1791. They helped Kamehameha obliterate rival chiefs with artillery fire that was decidedly unfair by local standards. Young's utility extended beyond pulling a lanyard. He supervised the conversion of Mailekini Heiau at Kauai into a modern fort armed with ship cannons guarding the royal residence at Pu'ukohola. He eventually served as the governor of Hawaii Island from approximately 1802 to 1812, managing trade and affairs while the king was occupied on other islands. Young also became a primary historical witness for the violent churn of the 1790s. He provided detailed accounts of the Olowalu massacre and confirmed to later visitors that Simon Metcalfe had died at Koyas, Haida Gwaii, in 1795, never knowing his son's fate. Ultimately, Young fully assimilated into the elite stratum of Hawaiian society. He married the High Chiefess Kaʻena, the niece of Kamehameha I, cementing his lineage within the ruling family. His granddaughter, Queen Emma, would later marry Kamehameha IV, placing the boatswain's DNA at the very center of the monarchy. When he died in 1835, he was buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Mauna Ala, a privilege reserved strictly for royalty and the highest chiefs. He was in for the long haul. Aikake and the Red-Mouthed Kingdom. If Young was the political anchor of Kamehameha's rise, Isaac Davis was the hardened survivor who turned a literal massacre into a career in high government. Known in the islands as Aikake, This Welsh sailor's integration into Hawaiian nobility is a story of catastrophic bad luck, followed immediately by the most fortunate linguistic fumble in maritime history. Davis arrived in March 1790 aboard that doomed vessel, the Fair American. The tiny schooner essentially functioned as a floating sidecar to Simon Metcalfe's larger brig. As established, the local High Chief Kamehameha had already decided the small ship would pay the price for the fleet's previous disrespect. Unfortunately for Davis, he was on deck when the bill came due. When the ship sat becalmed off Kauai, Davis sensed the mounting danger. He urged his young captain, Thomas Metcalfe, to keep the approaching canoes at bay. Captain Metcalfe ignored him, displaying the overconfidence of a lusty youth paired with a disastrous lack of caution. The assault was swift. As a chief seized the captain, Davis pulled a pistol to defend him. In a moment proving that fate possesses a twisted sense of humor, the gun misfired. The subsequent sequence of events was less a battle and more a dismantling. Davis was thrown overboard. His captors held him underwater until he was half drowned. They hauled him into a canoe and proceeded to jump on his neck and shoulders. Just as his life was about to be extinguished, the battered foreigner looked up at a warrior and gasped out, "Mighty!" his desperate, mangled attempt at maitai, meaning good. The warrior, either baffled or impressed that his victim was reviewing his own beating positively, replied, "Aroha, aloha." He ceased the violence and bound up Davis's wounds. Kamehameha I was reportedly appalled by the brutality of the capture. He received the survivor and reunited him with John Young, placing both men at the center of the most ambitious nation-building project in the Pacific. Davis did not just recover. He adapted with a speed driven by severe pragmatism. Joining Young in operating the captured artillery during the bloody unification campaigns, Davis cemented his own place as a central pillar of Kamehameha's military modernization. His transformation was total. Kamehameha elevated Davis to the rank of High Chief, a status confirmed by his marriage into the royal family and his vast estates. He was no longer a shipwrecked Welshman. He was Aikake, a statesman whose loyalty to the kingdom was absolute. Despite the extreme violence of his introduction to the islands, Davis reportedly held no grudge against his former captain. He later claimed he would have willingly served under Simon Metcalfe again, a level of forgiveness bordering on pathological given Metcalfe's track record. Loyalty remained a dangerous currency in the volatile political landscape of a unifying kingdom. In 1810, during tense negotiations to bring the holdout island of Kauai under Kamehameha's rule, a faction of dissatisfied chiefs conspired to poison Kaumoali, the visiting monarch of Kauai. Davis learned of the plot and warned the visiting king. He saved Kaumoali's life and preserved the diplomatic peace. The conspirators retaliated against the whistleblowing. Shortly after the incident in April 1810, Isaac Davis died suddenly. Historians and contemporaries concluded he was poisoned for exposing the assassination plot. His death struck Kamehameha as a devastating loss, but Davis's legacy was secured when John Young adopted his children, ensuring the Welshman's lineage would remain woven into the fabric of the Hawaiian monarchy for generations. In the case of Isaac Davis, integrity proved fatal. His trajectory showed that while surviving a maritime massacre might require nothing more than a well-timed linguistic fumble, doing the right thing typically just gets you a strictly ceremonial funeral. Fair American Kamehameha's captured thunder. Long before the political intrigues of the 19th century brought Isaac Davis to his untimely end, his survival and sudden elevation to the peerage depended entirely on the continuing utility of the vessel that had brought him to the disastrous party. The commandeered merchant schooner rattled its salt-encrusted anchor chain. Kamehameha I did not treat the Fair American as a mere hood ornament of conquest. Immediately following the bloodshed off Kauai in March 1790, the king engaged in a masterful campaign of information denial. He ordered the 26-ton prize hauled up and concealed. He then implemented a strict communication blackout between the shore and Simon Metcalfe's brig, the Eleanora, which rocked gently on the swell nearby. This strategic silence ensured the elder Metcalfe never learned his son Thomas had been killed. It prevented a retaliatory bombardment while securing the king a shiny new tactical asset. To operate this asset, Kamehameha retained the services of Davis and the Eleanora's detained boatswain, John Young. They were not prisoners in the traditional sense, rotting in a dungeon. Rather, they were recruited as high-value military contractors. Their task was to refit the schooner and train Hawaiian crews in the distinctively European art of ballistic diplomacy. The vessel provided Kamehameha with a mobile artillery platform that fundamentally altered the geopolitical calculus of the archipelago. In 1790, at the Battle of Kaʻena, the ship's cannon, including a piece affectionately christened Lopaka, combined with the musketry directed by Young and Davis to convert the Oʻahu Valley into a grim abattoir for the defending Maui army. The acquisition contained a profound historical irony. The very instrument designed to facilitate foreign resource extraction became the hammer that successfully forged indigenous unification. This shift was fully realized during the 1791 Battle of Kepuahaulaula, or the Battle of the Red-Mouthed Guns, off the Waipio coast. Here, the fair American engaged a combined fleet from Maui and Kauai. Accounts place Kamehameha himself on the schooner's deck. He commanded a hybrid force where Western naval architecture served the exclusive ambitions of a Polynesian high chief. Perhaps the most telling metric of this integration was the speed at which the foreign consultants made themselves obsolete. While the British explorer George Vancouver noted the vessel's continued service in 1794, the American trader Josiah Roberts reported that same year that the fair American was under the command of a Hawaiian captain and was navigated altogether by natives. Within 4 years, the schooner had transitioned from a foreign intruder to a naturalized citizen of the Hawaiian Navy, effectively erasing the line between imported technology and local expertise. Like many workhorses of the maritime fur trade, the vessel eventually ghosted from the record. There is no marked grave or underwater wreckage for the fair American. Historians generally assume the small ship, roughly 33 feet in length and exhausted by trans-Pacific crossings and coastal combat, was simply worn out, broken up, or quietly retired as the king upgraded to larger, more impressive frigates. But its brief, violent prime had permanently shifted the balance of power, forcing rival chiefs to recognize that holding ground now required an absolute mastery of black powder and foreign alliances. Kaʻena fell at Nuuanu Pali. While John Young and Isaac Davis rode their mastery of the fair American's cannon into Kamehameha's inner circle, High Chief Kaʻena felt the distinct chill of a vanishing political horizon. He was confronting an abrupt professional redundancy, the stomach-churning realization that the kingdom's newest arrivals were directing tactical decisions without him. Kaʻena's trouble started with the diplomatic equivalent of bad paperwork. Although the capture of the fair American and the killing of Thomas Metcalfe were technically the handiwork of another high chief, Kamehameha, a bloody retaliatory invoice for the Olowalu slaughter and a flogging, Kaʻena found his name attached to the lingering fallout. In May 1791, a deserter named Riddler, presumably enjoying the brief relevance of being a gossip with a captive audience, told American Captain Joseph Ingram that while Kaʻena was not a participant himself in the schooner's seizure, he was very much implicated in the entire messy affair. It was guilt by association, compounded by the fact that Kaʻena had previously been the kingdom's preeminent worldly figure. He had returned from Canton in 1788 with a cache of foreign weapons and the swagger of a man who had navigated the broader world. For a time, that arsenal and his first-hand knowledge of foreign trade made him an indispensable advisor. He was the man who brought the muskets. But the capture of the fair American delivered something more dangerous than hardware into Kamehameha's orbit. It brought the expertise required to fire it. In the immediate aftermath, Kaʻena remained allied with Kamehameha I, helping secure additional muskets and powder from arriving ships like a diligent quartermaster. Yet the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Young and Davis were foreign sailors who knew how to maintain, load, and fire heavy artillery with lethal precision. As they proved their worth, coordinating accurate salvos and earning swift elevation into the chiefly class, Kaʻena's unique value as the sole well-traveled chief began to rapidly depreciate. He was facing swift obsolescence, forced to maintain his composure while the new artillerymen rewrote the island's rules of engagement. By 1795, his decline in status was unmistakable. During the massive build-up for the invasion of Oʻahu, Kaʻena found himself deliberately excluded from Kamehameha's inner war council. Recognizing this as a slight that usually preceded a violent demotion, he made a desperate strategic pivot. As the vast invasion fleet crossed the channel toward Oʻahu, Kaʻena defected, peeling his canoes away to join the defending forces of Kalaniʻikupule, the island's doomed king. It was a bold and ultimately tragic gamble. At the Battle of Nuuanu, Kaʻena helped the Oʻahu army fortify the mist-shrouded ridges of the Pali, setting up gun ports in a final effort to hold the line. But Kamehameha's forces had become a military juggernaut, bolstered by the exact foreign weapons and artillerymen Kaʻena had once championed and been eclipsed by. The invaders overwhelmed the defenders, driving them up the lush valley and over the sheer drop of the cliffs. In the chaos of the fight, Kaʻena was killed. Accounts differ on whether a cannonball, a musket shot, or a spear ended him, but the historical irony was absolute. The first Hawaiian chief to travel the globe and return with the secrets of the West died fighting the military machine those secrets had built. He crossed the ocean to bring the world to the islands, only for the islands to be conquered by the world he brought. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 5, Kaʻena Point, Kamehameha, and the comeback whale. After years of scanning empty water on a flight to Maui, it turns out all it took was a longer walk, a Space Force parking situation, and one very cooperative humpback to finally settle the score. Coming up in Chapter 6, the monarchy that Kamehameha built faces the harder work of surviving the century after him, from the abolition of the kapu system to a young king dying of measles in London, and eventually a queen under house arrest in her own palace composing music while the world outside voted on whether her kingdom still existed. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon. The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon. Until next time, this has been The Rise the Limit.